Why are you giving this back?
Because that was never the point. Keep the money. You're going to need it.
What did she do?
You didn't even ask me if it was true.
She was innocent.
I didn't come back for revenge. I came back for the truth.
3 years after a divorce that stripped her of her home, her reputation, and the career she built from nothing, Simone Ellery never expected the man who called her a traitor to walk through the door of the roadside diner where she waited tables. Bennett Carrington settled into a corner booth, studied the worn uniform on his ex-wife, and left a $10,000 check on the table like a public act of mercy. Simone walked out to the parking lot and pressed the check into his hand with a plain black envelope. When Bennett opened it, the smile was gone. Stay until the very end, because that black envelope was not asking for pity. It was collecting a debt from an empire. The drive from downtown Charlotte to the Carrington Crown construction site normally took 40 minutes along the western corridor. But that morning Bennett's car developed a slow pressure problem, and the nearest place to pull over was a stretch of county road where Harbor Light Diner sat with its yellow sign and cracked asphalt lot, unchanged since the 1980s. Bennett had passed the sign a dozen times without registering it as a place real people went. To him it was background scenery on the way to more important destinations. He stepped out in a charcoal suit that cost more than some people paid in quarterly rent, and Conrad Wexler followed in a three-piece the same dark shade, both of them squinting against the morning light as though the diner owed them a better entrance. 2 investors from the Meridian Group completed the party, their briefcases unnecessary, but carried out of habit, the kind of men who brought credentials to a coffee shop the way other people brought coupons. Inside, the lunch counter smelled of griddle oil and old wood, and the morning crowd was mostly electricians and county workers who had no interest in Carrington Crown Holdings or whatever project was rising at the edge of their county. Mavis Delaney moved between the kitchen and the register, with the efficiency of someone who had been running the same floor for 3 decades, her voice carrying exactly the right amount of authority to keep things moving. She had taken on an extra hand for the midday rush, a woman named Simone who had been working the evening shift for nearly 2 years and had agreed to cover when a coworker called out sick. Simone was refilling a coffee carafe when the door swung open, and the particular quality of silence that followed told her something had changed in the room. She did not drop the carafe. She did not go pale or grip the counter. She completed the pour she had started, set the carafe back on its burner, and turned toward the new table the way she had turned toward every other table that morning, with a notepad and the measured calm of someone who had learned that composure was not indifference, but a form of precision. Bennett looked up from the menu, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved, because the mind does strange things when it meets a version of the past it had assumed was settled. The woman he was looking at had once stood at the head of a conference room and restructured a $240 million capital arrangement with the kind of fluency that made senior board members stop interrupting her mid-sentence. Conrad recovered first, because Conrad always did, his voice taking on the particular warmth of a man who enjoys having something to hold over another person. He asked Simone whether she was happy here, said it the way some people say it when they mean the opposite, and suggested that if she ever wanted an introduction to something with better hours, he was sure he could make a call. One of the Meridian investors said something about how at least she still knew how to work with the successful, and the other one smiled at the table as though that were clever. Simone wrote down their orders without missing a word, brought everything out correctly the first time, and gave each person exactly as much attention as their order required, and not 1 degree more. When the check came, Bennett pulled out a checkbook and wrote a figure that would have covered Mavis's mortgage for 4 months, slid it towards Simone's side of the table, and said something about new beginnings in the voice men use when they believe they are being generous. He believed it in the way that people believe they are generous when the gift costs them nothing emotionally and confirms what they already think about their own position in the world. Simone looked at the check, said nothing at the table, and finished her remaining tasks before she did anything else, because there was a right time and a wrong time, and a diner floor in front of witnesses was neither. She caught him in the parking lot before his car had been reloaded. She held the check out with both hands flat and deliberate, then produced a plain black envelope from her apron pocket and offered it the same way a notary presents a document, with full presence and no apology. Bennett took both items with the reflex of a man who accepts things people hand him, because not many people handed him things rather than receiving them, and the novelty was just enough to make him take them before he thought about what they were. Simone told him that he should probably hold on to the money, because once he read what was inside, he would likely need it more than she did. Bennett waited until he was back beside the car to open the envelope, with Conrad and the two Meridian men standing close enough to see over his shoulder, which Simone had anticipated, and which was part of why she had given it to him there, and not in a private room. The envelope did not contain a letter, a threat, or anything designed to appeal to his emotions. It contained 3 pages of legal documentation printed on plain white paper and organized with the kind of clinical clarity that belongs to people who have spent years building ironclad arguments from the outside. The first page was a formal transfer notice confirming that the $780 million debt held against Carrington Crown Holdings had changed hands, acquired in full by Langford Sovereign Capital through a structured purchase completed 11 days prior. The second page was a suspension order on the resort development project, citing material irregularities in the underlying financial disclosures. The third was a notice of emergency creditor conference, requiring the principal officers of Carrington Crown to appear within 48 hours. At the bottom of the third page, in the space designated for the creditor's investigative representative, was a name that Bennett recognized immediately and a title he had not expected: Special Investigative Advisor, retained by Langford Sovereign Capital. Conrad read it over his shoulder and something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, but in the particular way that a card player's face changes when the hand turns in a direction he hadn't planned for. One of the Meridian men began asking very precise questions about the resort's financial structure, questions that needed answers before his firm committed another dollar to anything with Carrington Crown's name on it. Bennett turned toward the spot where Simone had been standing, but she had already walked back inside, and through the window she was refilling someone's water glass with the same unhurried attention she had given to every table that morning. He asked Conrad, loudly enough that the investors heard, what exactly was happening with the debt portfolio, and Conrad said what Conrad always said when he needed time: that it was technical, that it had been managed, that the legal team had it under control. But his voice had a new quality in it, slightly too quick, slightly too assured, and Bennett had known Conrad for 16 years, long enough to know the difference between the man managing a situation and the man who needed you to believe he was managing a situation. On the drive back, Conrad explained that Victoria Langford ran a fund built on acquiring distressed corporate debt and using the leverage to strip assets at a discount, that the move was predatory and had nothing to do with the old business between Bennett and his ex-wife, that Simone was being used by someone who understood how to weaponize personal grievance. It was a convincing explanation, the kind that almost worked, and it might have worked entirely if Bennett had not sat down that evening with the quarterly access reports and noticed that his own authentication credentials had been locked out of 3 subsidiary accounts he had been using regularly since January. He called the internal systems team and was told the restriction had been flagged by the compliance review process, and that he would need to submit a formal request to restore access to accounts he had personally established. The one line in the documentation that he returned to twice during that night was a footnote buried in the creditor's transfer summary. The current audit had identified transactions in the historical record previously attributed to a former officer of Carrington Crown, and the results of that review would be presented at the creditor conference. He knew which former officer the footnote meant. He sat at his desk for a long time after that, not reading anything, just sitting with the particular feeling of a man who has spent 3 years building a story about the past and is now watching one of its walls develop a crack. The story of how Simone Ellery came to work at Carrington Crown was not a story of ambition climbing toward wealth, but of a professional brought in to do a precise and difficult job at a moment when the company had no good options. Bennett had been 39 when his father's estate passed to him, under conditions that included a poison pill acquisition threat from a private equity group that wanted to break the company into pieces and sell them. And he had hired Simone on a consulting basis, after seeing her dismantle a similar attempt for a regional client with a restructuring strategy that 3 senior advisors had said could not be done. She worked 16-hour days for 5 months, restructured 4 capital arrangements, and negotiated the kind of terms that required both a precise legal mind and the willingness to sit in a room and not blink when the other side needed you to blink. When it was over, the acquisition threat was gone, and Carrington Crown had a path toward expansion that had not existed before she arrived. They fell into something neither of them had planned for, carefully at first, and then with the full weight of 2 people who had been too focused on their work to pay attention to what was happening between them. Bennett was a man who respected competence above almost everything, and Simone was one of the most competent people he had ever worked beside. And for a period of time after they married, that respect held everything together, even when the Carrington family made clear in 100 small ways that they had not expected a woman from outside their world to become part of it. Conrad Wexler was polite to her face and systematic in his efforts to reduce her authority behind her back, restructuring reporting lines, moving her out of key creditor meetings, telling the board with his particular brand of reasonable-sounding language that certain institutional investors expressed discomfort when decision-making power over the family's capital sat with someone outside the family's historical circle. Simone had documented every irregularity she found through 2 years of watching the company's books, and what she found was not minor. Payments to vendor entities whose registered addresses were mail forwarding services, transfer approvals that did not match the internal authorization chain, a pattern of small adjustments that individually looked like rounding corrections and together described a systematic drain. She assembled her findings and scheduled a meeting with Bennett for a Tuesday morning, but she never delivered them. On the Monday before, the internal system flagged her own account as the source of unauthorized data transfers and linked her authentication credentials to $42 million, moved through 3 intermediate holding companies over the previous 14 months. The package Conrad brought to Bennett was thorough, indexed, and presented with the gravity of a man who had no wish to be the bearer of bad news. It included transaction records, access logs, and a collection of email fragments that, read in sequence, created the portrait of an employee preparing to vanish with everything she had taken. Bennett confronted Simone that same evening, and what she remembered most was not what he said but what he refused to do. He would not show her the original data, would not tell her which specific credentials had been flagged, and when she asked him to let her prove what had happened before he acted, he said that the board had already been briefed, and that waiting was not something the company could afford. He signed her termination agreement on a Wednesday and filed for divorce 3 days later, and the official statement released by the company described the separation as a mutual decision, reached for professional reasons, which was accurate in the same way that a building is accurately described as standing even after all its internal structure has been removed. Simone left with what could be carried in 2 bags, and the press coverage used the word embezzlement in its first paragraph, because corrections are always smaller than headlines. On the day the divorce became final, Simone wrote one decision in a notebook she kept and did not share with anyone. She would not ask Bennett Carrington to believe her. She would make the truth present itself in a room where no one could look away from it. The financial sector in Charlotte was smaller than it appeared from inside it, and word moved through it, the way word moves through any community where reputation is also currency. Within 3 months of the Carrington Crown announcement, Simone had been turned down by every firm she applied to. Not always with an explanation, sometimes with a referral to a legal department that never responded, once with a phone call from a former colleague who said, with genuine apology in his voice, that his managing director had decided her name was too complicated right now. Her accounts remained frozen during the investigation period, and by the time the investigation concluded without criminal charges, because Conrad had been careful enough to leave nothing that rose to that threshold. The legal fees had consumed most of what she had set aside. She moved into a smaller apartment, and then into a room in a shared house, and neither of her housemates asked her about anything she did not volunteer. Mavis Delaney found her on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting at the Harbor Light Diner, with a cup of coffee she had been nursing for 2 hours, because she had nowhere particular to be, and the diner was warm. Mavis did not ask what had happened or where she had come from. She said she needed someone reliable for the evening shift starting the following Thursday, that the pay was what it was and the work was straightforward, and that she preferred someone who could be there on time and keep their composure when the dinner rush hit. Simone said yes without explanation, which Mavis appreciated, because Mavis had been running the diner since her husband passed and had long since stopped expecting people to explain themselves to her satisfaction before she gave them a chance. The shift became 2 shifts and then the regular evening, and Simone began to understand why the work suited her in ways that surprised her. Every table was a complete transaction. Someone needed something, she provided it. The exchange was honest, and at the end of it no one was pretending the relationship was something other than what it was. After midnight, when the diner quieted, she spread documents across the back corner table and worked through what she could reconstruct from memory and the few records she had saved to a personal drive before the system locked her out. She enrolled in a fraud examination certificate program through a regional college, completing coursework between shifts, and by the end of the first year, she had rebuilt enough of the original transaction map to understand the architecture of what had been done to her. The connection to Victoria Langford came through the kind of coincidence that is really just the product of sustained attention. Simone had been tracking a set of intermediate holding companies that appeared in the original transaction records, and one of them surfaced in a secondary market prospectus for a bond offering that Langford Sovereign Capital had partially subscribed. She did not write to Victoria asking for help or sympathy. She wrote a 4-page technical memo identifying the specific mechanism by which the bond's underlying assets had been valued above their recoverable worth, with a recommendation to request independent verification before the tranche closed. Victoria's team confirmed the analysis within 2 weeks. The fund declined the position, and Victoria called Simone directly. The consulting arrangement that followed was conducted through documents and secure communications, and Simone continued working at the diner because several things required her to be there. Mavis had begun receiving pointed letters about the commercial value of her land parcel. Julian Cross had communicated through an intermediary that he would only deliver what he had kept in a neutral location that had no connection to the financial world. And Simone had decided that her work, rebuilding the case, would not become something she concealed from the people around her, as though she were ashamed of where she had landed. When she reviewed the debt portfolio that Langford Sovereign was considering acquiring, she recognized the architecture with the clarity of someone seeing a face they have not seen in years, but have never stopped knowing. Conrad Wexler had built Carrington Crown's current debt structure using the same intermediate company framework he had used to destroy her. Bennett arrived at Carrington Crown headquarters the morning after the diner encounter and asked his assistant to pull the full debt file. The complete version, every document from the original credit agreements through the most recent refinancing. What his assistant brought him was a binder that represented a curated summary rather than underlying documentation. And when he asked for the originals, he was told they were archived in the CFO's office, and that Conrad had flagged them for a legal review. Bennett walked down the corridor to Conrad's office himself, and the conversation that followed was brief and did not go the way he expected. Conrad was smooth and explanatory, offered to have the documents sent over by end of day, said that certain files had been migrated during a system upgrade in March, and the retrieval process was taking longer than it should, and the whole explanation was delivered in the tone of a man who had given similar explanations before and had learned which words made people stop asking. End of day came without the documents. Bennett sent a message and received a reply that the legal team had placed a temporary hold for compliance reasons. He called the compliance department directly and was told the hold had been placed at the CFO's direction. He called the external auditors and was told their most recent access request was under review. For the first time in his career at his own company, Bennett Carrington could not get the information he was asking for, and the sensation was disorienting in the specific way. That disorientation hits people who have spent their lives in environments designed to give them what they need before they finish asking. He sent a message to Simone asking if she would meet. She responded with a time and a location: Harbor Light Diner, not his offices, not a restaurant he chose, not a conference room arranged by his team. He showed up in a suit and she was in her uniform, and she brought him coffee and asked what he wanted to know. He asked her, without framing it carefully, what it would take to close the matter, and she looked at him with an expression that contained something close to exhaustion, and said that the question itself told her everything, about how little had changed in 3 years. She placed 4 transaction records on the table between them, printed on receipt paper, because she had not brought her full files. Each transaction carried her digital authentication. Each had been processed through her access credentials, and each had been completed during a window, when she and Bennett had been in Charleston for a 3-day investor summit, where her company laptop had remained in their hotel room, and the resort's system logs would show she had never once connected to the corporate network. Bennett knew the Charleston trip because it was the last trip they had taken before everything collapsed, the last time he remembered them being something uncomplicated. He looked at the dates on the receipts and then looked at her, and she watched him do the arithmetic. She did not accept what came next, which was an expression on his face moving toward apology, and she stopped it before it arrived. She said that the documents proved she had not committed a crime, but they did not prove he had been a good husband, and those were 2 separate questions that deserved separate answers. She listed what he had done without raising her voice, refused her access to the original evidence, processed her termination in the same week as the divorce filing, allowed the company's public statement to use language that implied guilt, and in 3 years had not once reached out to ask whether she was alive or housed or managing. She said he had made a calculation, and the calculation had prioritized the stock price over the truth, and that was a choice, not a mistake. Julian Cross had not appeared at the agreed time and location, and Simone checked the window 3 times during their conversation without explaining why, and Bennett noticed and did not ask, which was perhaps the first instinct he had shown all day that she considered appropriate. Conrad had sources inside the media cycle, the same way he had sources inside most systems he needed to manage. And by the morning after Bennett's visit to the diner, 3 publications had received background briefings about Simone's role in an alleged campaign by Langford Sovereign Capital to use personal grievance as a vehicle for hostile asset acquisition. The framing was elegant and specific: a bitter former wife, a sympathetic billionaire patron, a coordinated effort to destabilize a legitimate company by weaponizing an old internal investigation that had already been resolved. The articles did not say anything actionable, but they did not need to. They just needed to put certain words in proximity to each other and let the inference do the rest. By midday, footage from inside the diner appeared on 2 news feeds. Someone at a table with a phone angled at Simone's station, the caption describing her as the center of a financial controversy involving her ex-husband's corporation. Mavis watched the coverage on the small television above the register, and said nothing to anyone about it. A regular customer repeated something he had read aloud, not maliciously, just the way people repeat things they've encountered, and used the word calculated. Mavis refreshed his coffee, told him the pie was good today, and did not fire Simone, or ask her to take a leave of absence, or suggest that things might be easier if she kept a lower profile. Some decisions are made without deliberation, because a person has already settled the question of what kind of person they are, and Mavis had settled that question a long time ago. The note from Julian Cross arrived through a mechanism Simone had not anticipated. A small envelope left at the diner counter by someone who ordered black coffee, drank half of it, and left without finishing. Tucked inside the flap was a strip of paper with 11 characters written in pencil, a facility code and a unit number, alongside one sentence. The system logs had never been on the Carrington network. Beside the paper was a flat, square key of the kind used for lockers in storage facilities, and Julian's absence from the planned meeting was explained in the note's margin. His building's management company had sent him a lease termination notice based on a noise complaint that had never been filed, a technique Simone recognized because she had once seen it applied to a vendor who had seen too much. Bennett's own investigation had taken a different turn. He had asked his personal attorney to pull the physical signing records for the resort acquisition, and the attorney had come back with a complication. 3 of the documents carried Bennett's signature on dates when he had been in another city for medical appointments he had kept confidential from the board. He had not signed those documents. He had not authorized anyone else to sign them. Someone had used a reproduction of his signature to execute agreements that committed Carrington Crown to terms that would be catastrophically difficult to exit. When Simone showed him the key, he showed her the signature copies, and neither of them said the obvious thing, because the obvious thing did not need to be said. They were being held in place by the same hand. Getting to the storage facility required them to work together in a way that neither of them was comfortable with, because trust is not rebuilt by sharing a problem. It is rebuilt by what a person does when the problem gives them room to act badly, and they choose not to. The facility was across town in an industrial complex that had once housed a regional auditing firm before it closed quietly and left behind boxes no one had claimed. Inside the unit, resting in a hard-sided case, with padding used for electronics that cannot be replaced, was an external drive with a label in Julian's handwriting. The timestamp on the last backup was dated 3 days after Simone's termination, and the data it contained showed that her account credentials had been accessed exclusively from a workstation registered to Conrad Wexler's private office suite. Victoria Langford's legal team spent 18 hours with the drive and produced a verification report that ran to 61 pages, which Simone read in full and annotated in the margins with the attentiveness of someone who had been waiting 3 years for this particular document to exist. The core finding was unambiguous. Every access event attributed to Simone's credentials had originated from Conrad Wexler's private workstation, not from the devices assigned to her, not from the remote access nodes she used, not from any system she had ever touched. The timestamps on 4 of the most significant transfers had been manually altered using a system administration function that Simone had never been granted access to, but that Conrad held at a clearance level the board had approved without ever reviewing what it actually permitted. The picture that emerged was not of a conspiracy requiring many participants. It required only one person with the right access, the right patience, and the confidence that no one above him would look carefully enough. Julian Cross reappeared 2 days after the drive was recovered. Arriving at the diner in the early morning before the breakfast rush and sitting in the corner booth that had become the seat of record for every significant conversation this case had produced. He had kept copies of everything because he had worked in compliance long enough to know that the things a company most wants to disappear are the things most worth preserving, and he was willing to testify because he had already lost what Conrad could use against him, and there was a certain freedom in that. He confirmed that 3 years earlier, Conrad had instructed the compliance team to alter access timestamps in the internal audit log and had framed the request as a routine data integrity correction. Bennett arrived at the diner that same morning, separately and without being asked, and the three of them sat with coffee and talked for 2 hours about what had happened and what could be proved. Bennett apologized in the specific and detailed way that means something. Not a general expression of regret, but an itemized account of each decision he had made and what he now understood it had cost. Simone listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she said she appreciated the clarity, but that the apology and the exoneration were separate matters, and she intended to handle them separately. She told him plainly what she had told herself every day since the divorce, that he had not merely trusted the wrong person, he had structured their entire marriage in a way that made her easy to discard when the economics required it. And that was a failure of character that had nothing to do with Conrad's forgeries, and everything to do with what Bennett had decided she was worth when the test came. He sat with that for a long time and did not argue with it. The operational plan was Victoria's in structure and Simone's in detail. Victoria would convene the creditor conference as scheduled. Bennett would attend and behave exactly as Conrad expected, and Conrad would bring the resort documentation, expecting to use the meeting to formalize his own position, because he had been quietly polling board members and believed he had the votes to propose a leadership transition. He had prepared a motion and arranged for a proxy firm to submit supporting documents, and he had done all of this with the confidence of a man who had been the most dangerous person in every room he had entered for the past 15 years. He had not considered the possibility that the most dangerous person in the room might be someone he had tried to bury in a diner on a county road. The creditor conference was held in the Carrington Crown boardroom on the 22nd floor, with a view of the Charlotte skyline that on clear days reached to the hills, and the room was arranged the way such rooms always are when power is expected to consolidate. Legal teams on one side, board members on the other, and at the head of the table a space for whoever was expected to control the proceedings. Conrad had arrived early and positioned himself in the chair closest to the presentation screen, and he had brought a binder, private counsel, and a document that proposed the immediate appointment of an interim CEO pending a governance review, with his own name in the relevant field. The Meridian investors were present, along with 4 other institutional stakeholders who had arrived with their own attorneys and their own questions about the resort transaction. Victoria Langford entered with 2 members of her legal team and took the seat designated for the creditor's representative without asking whether it was available. She wore the particular expression of someone who has purchased the building and is being courteous enough not to mention it. Simone entered after her, and she was wearing the Harbor Light Diner uniform, which was not an oversight. She had considered it for 3 days, and concluded that if the room needed to see where she had been in order to understand where she was standing now, then the room should see it clearly. She placed a black envelope on the boardroom table, the same kind she had pressed into Bennett's hand in the parking lot, and took the seat beside Victoria without looking at Conrad. Conrad moved to take control of the agenda, suggesting that certain individuals present lacked standing to participate in a governance discussion, gesturing towards Simone with the practiced precision of a man who has rehearsed this particular dismissal. He said that the creditor's choice of representative was irregular, and that someone with a documented personal and legal history involving the subject company could not be considered impartial. Victoria said, without lifting her eyes from the document in front of her, that she was welcome to retain whatever representative she chose, and that her choice had been based on a technical analysis of Carrington Crown's financial architecture that no one else in the market had produced. Simone opened the envelope, and the contents were distributed to every person at the table simultaneously, the way evidence is distributed when the goal is not persuasion but recording. The drive data, independently authenticated by a forensic firm with no prior relationship to either party. The access logs showing Conrad's workstation as the origin of every transaction attributed to Simone. The transfer orders executed from Conrad's terminal over 14 months. The registry documents for 11 shell companies, all bearing nominee directors traced to a single registered agent used exclusively by Carrington Crown vendors under Conrad's procurement authority. Julian Cross entered through the side door at the moment that had been coordinated in advance, and his notarized statement was included in the distribution packet. Bennett confirmed aloud, for the record, and without prompting, that the signatures appearing on the 3 resort acquisition documents were not his, and that he had been in a verifiable location on each date those signatures were purportedly made. He then said, in a sentence that took some effort, that he was placing in the record a formal acknowledgement that his former wife's termination had been based on fabricated evidence and that the company's conduct toward her had been wrong, not required of him by the proceedings, but chosen anyway. Conrad's attorney advised him not to speak. He did not speak. The room continued without him as Victoria announced that the debt transfer carried conditions, triggering a full governance restructure effective immediately. The creditor conference concluded with Conrad Wexler, suspended from all company functions pending referral to the Financial Crimes Division, the resort transaction voided pending review, and the board's formal acknowledgement that a comprehensive governance audit was required before any major decisions could proceed. The room emptied in the way rooms empty after something significant has happened. People moved more carefully, spoke more quietly, and the conversations in the corridor had the character of people recalibrating rather than celebrating. The board offered Simone her old role back. 3 members came to her separately in the hour following the meeting, and all 3 used similar language about stability and continuity, and the importance of having someone who understood the company's structure at the center of its recovery. They expected her to accept because the offer was the logical resolution of the story they had been watching, the part where the wrongly accused person is restored to the position they lost. Simone thanked each of them and declined. What she asked for instead was specific, written, and non-negotiable. She wanted a public statement of exoneration, formal and detailed, distributed to every publication that had run the original embezzlement coverage. She wanted restitution for the employees Conrad had pressured into resigning, calculated at their last salary, extended across the period of their unemployment. She wanted the eviction notice against Harbor Light Diner voided and the land parcel removed permanently from the development pipeline. She wanted the audit function separated structurally from executive oversight, reporting to an independent committee with no Carrington family members. She wanted a whistleblower protection fund established with an initial endowment large enough to mean something and governed by a board that included people outside the financial industry. And she wanted the equity stake she had been entitled to, under her original employment agreement, calculated from the date she should have received it. Victoria confirmed she would support every point, and the board approved the terms within 72 hours, because refusing them was not a viable position for a company under creditor supervision. Bennett stepped back from the CEO role voluntarily, framing it as necessary time to address the governance failures that had occurred on his watch. He had not directed the fraud, but he had created the conditions under which it thrived by building an organization where his own comfort with certainty overrode the mechanisms that should have questioned it. He said this publicly and did not hire a communications firm to soften it first. Simone used a portion of her settlement to purchase the land parcel beneath Harbor Light Diner outright and transferred the deed to Mavis without conditions. No buyback clause, no right of first refusal, no arrangement that converted a gift into a form of ownership. Mavis accepted it the way she accepted most things, briefly, directly, and with the specific grace of someone who has been underestimated long enough to recognize when someone is not underestimating her. Bennett asked in the parking lot afterward whether there was any path that led somewhere other than where they currently were, and Simone told him he was free to rebuild whatever he chose, but that she was not a prize at the end of that process. Not the measure of whether his rebuilding had succeeded, not the destination that made the work meaningful. He could begin again. She had already begun. She handed him the black envelope, now empty, and told him that this time the question of what to put inside was entirely his. A year passed, and Charlotte moved through its seasons the way it always does, and in that time, Carrington Crown restructured under new leadership and met its revised financial targets for the first time in 4 years, which the business press attributed to decisive governance reform and strong oversight from the creditor. Bennett returned to a reduced executive role after a supervised transition period, during which he attended every board meeting as a non-voting observer, which he had requested as a condition of his return because he had decided that watching decisions being made without being the person making them was something he needed to learn how to do. He was not celebrated the way he had once been celebrated, and the loss of the particular deference that attaches to certain kinds of men in certain kinds of rooms was something he had not anticipated grieving, and grieving it was necessary. Conrad Wexler's case moved through the legal system at the pace such cases move, which is slower than justice and faster than erasure. The charges were substantial: financial fraud, forgery of legal instruments, obstruction of an audit, breach of fiduciary duty. The reputation he had spent 30 years building, the reputation that had been used, among other purposes, to ensure that no one listened too carefully to what a 37-year-old black woman was trying to tell them about the numbers, became in the proceeding one of the prosecution's central exhibits, because the sophistication of the scheme required someone trusted enough to execute it without scrutiny. And Conrad had been trusted in direct proportion to his standing. Simone opened Ellery Forensic Partners in a converted office space 2 miles from downtown, with a staff of 4 in the first year, and a client list built primarily through referrals from people who had watched what happened at Carrington Crown and understood that someone who could find that kind of buried fraud inside a family empire could find it anywhere. The firm took cases other investigators considered too complicated or too politically uncomfortable, and she was specific in interviews about why. The people most often harmed by financial fraud inside corporations are those with the least structural protection, and the skills required to expose that harm are worth developing and deploying systematically, not only when the case happened to be her own. She did not describe herself as a crusader and would have been visibly impatient with anyone who did. She described herself as a forensic analyst with relevant experience. She still came to Harbor Light Diner, not every day, and not for any particular reason, but the way a person returns to a place that has been more than its function. Mavis had used part of the settlement money to renovate the back room, installing tables and a projector screen, and on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the space ran a free bookkeeping and accounting workshop for workers looking to change industries. The enrollment list was always full. Simone taught 1 session a month, the one covering how to read a balance sheet, because it was the session with the highest dropout rate before she started teaching it, and her completion rate was nearly complete. Bennett came alone one Tuesday morning in November. He sat at the counter, ordered the same breakfast he had ordered. On the morning he had arrived with Conrad and the Meridian investors, and when Simone brought it out, he thanked her in the particular way of someone who has thought about what to say, and then decided to say less. He left a tip that was appropriate and nothing more. No check tucked beneath the plate, no figure with more zeros than the meal warranted. She looked at the bills and asked why he had not brought the $10,000 this time. He said it was because the $10,000 had never been a tip. It had been a way of standing above her without having to admit that was what he was doing. He slid a black envelope across the counter. She opened it and found a single document, a public statement of responsibility, signed, notarized, and already filed with the Court of Record, no negotiation attached to it, no request for anything in return. She did not answer him. She set the envelope on the counter between them, and for the first time in 3 years they sat across from each other as 2 people, without a verdict between them. Later, she slid the envelope into the drawer beneath the register, beside the $10,000 check that had never been cashed. A new hire asked her that evening why she kept a check that old without depositing it. Simone said that she kept it to remember something. There are days when someone looks at a worn uniform and believes they already know everything about the person inside it, and the work is not to convince them otherwise. The work is to refuse to forget what you are worth. The same way she had once stood in a parking lot with a check in one hand and a plain black envelope in the other, pressed them back into his hands, and walked away before he finished opening it.